Hi, Fran.
Hi, Barbara.
It's nice to see you today, and I've been really looking forward to this chance to talk to one another about the topic of reinvention, because you and I both had some reinventions in our lives, and maybe we can come up with some words of wisdom for the folks who are watching us today. You know, I was thinking recently, we've known each other for such a long time, since our undergraduate days at university. But after we graduated, our paths diverged, and that was both professionally and geographically. So it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago that I remember running into you on the street in New York City and reacquainting and discovering that both of us were in consulting type services. At that point, you had really reached the pinnacle of a wonderful career at Price Waterhouse PwC, and I was so impressed. You were the only woman, or the first woman, on both the U.S. and the global leadership teams, and you were so generous with your time, your connections, helping women entrepreneurs, and you even helped me when I moved to Brussels, and you helped me network with some of your PwC colleagues who were in the Brussels. I've always appreciated. So thinking about the fact that our careers have wandered around a little bit and we have had to reinvent ourselves, I thought it might be an interesting topic for leaders today to think about. What does that do to help you? What opportunity does it create? And how difficult is it to reinvent yourself as you move forward? And now there are probably more people than usual with the global pandemic who have either lost jobs or their businesses have downsized or closed. There are the young people graduating from university who are having trouble finding jobs. My own daughter, after September 11th, reinvented herself. So a crisis tends to present that pivot. And I wonder if you'd be willing to tell your story about reinvention, because I'm sure there's some lessons in there.
I'd be happy to, Barb. And I do remember that meeting on a New York street. It's amazing in a city of 8 million people, we could run into each other. But it was serendipity and I guess fate. So
yes.
Yeah, I've always been a proponent of reinvention, and it began fairly early. I was in my mid to late 20s. I had worked successfully in healthcare administration. I'd just gone and gotten a master's degree, and I came out with that degree and thought about my career options at that point. And I could have just gone back into administration. That would have been very easy, but I decided to pursue consulting, and I was lucky enough to get a couple offers, including Price Waterhouse at the time, and chose to take it, although I knew it was riskier. But like most of my reinventions, I was really driven by opportunity, and I knew this would be more opportunity, and it was. And things went well. I did well. Within a few years, I was made a partner, and all was good. Until about 4 years after I was admitted to the partnership, my firm informed me that they had decided to get out of that industry segment. By the way, they re-entered it later, of course, but at the time they were getting out. And they gave me two options. I was lucky that I had an option, actually. Many of my colleagues did not. And I could either leave the firm and continue to be in that industry, or I would have to almost totally reinvent myself. And it was a tough decision, but I decided the firm was more important and I would stay and take on that challenge. And I don't want to tell anybody that was easy. It was hard. It was really hard for the first 6 months. Not only was I leaving a comfortable industry niche that I had been in almost 20 years, one way or another, and having to work in many different industries, actually. But I had a whole new team. I had to basically rebuild from scratch a network of clients and contacts. And also, probably the hardest thing was my credibility was at stake. My colleagues who had all respected me weren't really sure I could do this. And people that worked for me especially weren't sure I could do it. And so I had to rebuild that credibility. But again, it worked. It was successful, and it taught me something super important. It was that A, I could reinvent, and B, it was actually good for me. I realized I had much broader opportunities and ways I could pursue my career than I had a year before that. So at that time, I made a commitment to myself that every 3 to 5 years, I was going to reinvent, whether I was asked to or not. And I did. And that next reinvention came about 4 years later. I was offered a newly created position to be in charge of strategic human capital for our consulting practice. It was an internal role, not client-facing. And I would also have to move from Washington to New York. So it was going to really disrupt my personal life. Most of my colleagues actually advised me not to do it. They said, you worked so hard to reinvent a few years ago, and you did it. You did it successfully. You should just enjoy that and build on it. You shouldn't take another big chance. And by the way, you shouldn't leave client service. That's not a great idea in a professional services firm. But I listened, but I pretty much ignored their advice and decided this was a very intriguing opportunity and I was going to take that risk. As it turned out, it was the best decision I ever made career-wise. And I was doing really important, strategic, creative work for the firm. And I was really able to change our core business and consulting in a meaningful way. So in addition to that, we call it now, I believe, managing your personal brand. I didn't know that phrase at that time, but that's exactly what I also did. Because this work was very high profile, I increased my credibility and just my name and my reputation among my colleagues, but also externally. And that meant a lot. And I think that's what brought me my next reinvention, which was about 3 years later. We had a brand new CEO, and I hadn't really worked with him, but he had seen my work. He'd heard about it. He'd read about it, all those good things. And he said, I'd like you to join my new global and U.S. leadership teams. And I would be, as you mentioned, the first woman that the firm had on those teams. So it was a great honor and a great opportunity. I was going to build on some of the work I'd already done, but really explore new other areas. So that was another great job. And I can assure you, I would never have gotten to the C-suite of this very large professional services firm had I not reinvented, not even just once, but 2 or 3 times during my career. So you can imagine that's why I'm a big proponent of reinvention.
So you've mentioned reinventing by design, which you decided. You made the choice. You were in control of that choice to a large extent. Sometimes it was being in the right place at the right time and having the nerve to take the risk and to make that jump. But you could control some of the planning and how you embraced that. That's one kind of reinvention. I think sometimes the more emotionally impactful reinvention was the first one that you mentioned, where it was completely involuntary. And it must feel somewhat like having the rug pulled right out from under you. So how do you deal with that emotional impact?
It was hard. I mentioned it was a hard 6 months. And I have to admit, the biggest part was my own ego. And I have a healthy ego, as most successful people do. And it was really difficult to swallow that and to realize that I needed to learn new things really rapidly. I needed to ask other people for help. And there was some fear. I was fearful that I might not be successful. It's probably the first time I felt that in my professional life. And it was also, you feel kind of untethered, I think. And that kind of brings to mind, I know that in addition to your own reinventions, you've coached many other leaders. And I'm curious what you've observed in your coachees in terms of whether they've reinvented, whether you've recommended it, whether you've coached them through reinventions, because I have a feeling there's some real lessons there too.
Yeah, and clearly a difference, whether it's involuntary or voluntary. And there can be risk on both sides. There can be fear on both sides. There can be uncertainty and apprehension. But if it's involuntary, I usually start with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model about grief. The whole idea that when one gets this devastating announcement that their industry area is going away, or their job is going away, or their business is closing, or there's a pandemic or a crisis that impacts them, the first reaction is shock. And then one may experience anger, rejection, and acceptance. Finally is what we're striving for, so that one can move on. Because that grief reaction of an involuntary need to reinvent just shakes one, or can shake one to the core. So what I see in the folks that I coach that are going through this is that we have to work through that first and acknowledge that it's a normal feeling, and build one up again in terms of their confidence to persevere. It is hard work to reinvent. It's like having another full-time job to then figure out how do you move on and embrace this new area. So what are some of the specific things you did as you moved on through each of these reinventions?
Well, I had a real aha moment, probably my deepest depths, when I had to actually reinvent completely against my will. And I had an aha that I have a lot of transferable skills, as probably most of the people that are viewing this do. In my case, I was a fabulous project manager. I was good with clients. I was good at managing teams, including fairly large teams. All of that was transferable when I reinvented. And I could rely on that. I didn't have to reinvent those, but I did have to acknowledge that I had developed skills and expertise in an area that was now no longer valuable to me and nor to the firm. And I had to develop new knowledge and skills. I had to hit the books again, if you will. Mm-hmm. I also found that I had been able to be an expert in and of my own right, not just with my team. And now I wasn't. I was probably never going to be that deep expert again. So I needed to rely on other people. I needed to leverage their expertise. I needed to both learn from them, but also just know when I didn't know this, and I needed to have them take the lead on the technical stuff. And that was a big transition. And as I said earlier, that lack of expertise particularly was the credibility hurdle initially. And it was actually as much from the people working for me, all these new people that didn't know me well in several different offices on the East Coast. They were just not sure I would be up to it. And over time, working with them, they saw that I brought value to the table. It wasn't the same value they were bringing to the table, which was great. It was collaborative work. And I think that is something you need to face when you reinvent. You have to be realistic, but you also need to rely on the fact that many of the attributes and skills that you already have can serve you well.
Yeah, I really like that advice. I think with some of the folks that I coach, what I find is they say, my resume depicts what I've done, and that's not going to help me. That industry's not there anymore. Those jobs aren't there anymore, whatever the case may be. And I say to them, we have to look beyond just the job you held and the task that you did, and think about what skills did you have to exhibit to do that task or perform in that job. So your example of project management, people management, managing teams, all that is so relevant in so many different areas. And so one has to think expansively when there is a need to reinvent, and think, where can you use those same tried and true skills that you have experience in when you try to reinvent.
And I think and I'm sure you advised your coachees of this, that we all have to be lifetime learners, actually. And even when you're in a single industry segment, I just naturally was a lifetime learner there. I didn't really have to work at it. I just did it. But now I had to work at it, and I always judge people. In fact, I put it into one of the systems we designed that we wanted what we called accelerated learners. And accelerated learners we defined as people who were learning for not the role they were in now or the job they were on the project, but for that next role. And I think, again, if anything, that is so much more important today and in the future than it even was 10 or 20 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. And when I look at the young folks coming out of university or even after their first job, I think they are actually much more willing than we were when we came out of university to say, oh, all right, I'm going to do this for a couple of years and get some experience. And then I'm going to go on and do this. And then after that, I'm going to do that. And they see a career as being able to jump from one thing to another with a core set of skills and apply it more expansively. So if they don't like something that they're doing, they can reinvent. So they can plan for.
Yeah, and I would, right. And I think as they do that, and then people do job hop so much more. I was lucky. I was in a big, very diverse firm, so I could move through those very different roles without having to leave. But whether you can do that now or you need to leave, I do think that you need to be realistic about what you know, what you don't know, and how to do it. And be really conscientious, be thoughtful, be intentional about it. Not assume you just hopscotch around anytime you kind of feel like it.
I think that's good advice for the moment too, because when there are lots of jobs out there, there's lots of business open, it might be easier to do that. We're not in that situation right now. And
yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, I was just going to say, and being strategic about it, I mentioned that opportunity was always what drove me and drove those reinventions. And I do think looking a little bit beyond that first job or even the next one, is this a place that is going to open up opportunities for you? Breadth and depth of opportunity is an important consideration when you're reinventing.
Yeah, so all those strategic questions are important ones to, yeah. So at the moment, for today's young leaders, what's the one tip you would give them? If you could only give them one tip, what would you tell them about reinvention?
I would tell them to be courageous, that nothing is forever, right? And some of my reinventions were easier than others. And I learned a lot along the way. So as long as you're intentional and thoughtful about it, it seems to me you need some courage, and you need to be able to put your ego a bit aside, at least in the beginning.
I like that. Thank you for that. Maybe courage is another topic we can talk about on another day. Thanks, Fran. You are such a wonderful role model, particularly for women leaders. And I appreciate your generosity and your sharing of your advice. So we'll talk again soon. Thanks for being on Let's Talk Leadership.
Thank you. And thanks, Barbara, for the dialogue.